Shiela Crerar, Psychic Detective. Written by Ella M. Scrymsour. Narrated by Naomi Rose Mock. The Eyes of Doom, originally published in the Blue Magazine, May 1920. Shiela Crerar felt very lonely as she sat in her tiny sitting room in her dreary lodgings. She was tired too, mentally as well as physically, and she tried to forget the misery of the past 6 months. An orphan, she had been brought up by an uncle who idolized her. For 22 years she had lived in happiness in their home in the Highlands. She could visualize it now, a smallish house for a laird, built in the true Scottish baronial style with turreted roof and pepper-box corners and a tiny courtyard. Craig was built on the top of a high eminence overlooking Loch Lubnaig, and it had been one of her chief delights to sit among the heather and watch the rippling waters of the lake beneath. To her left was Ben Leddy, and she revelled in his rugged beauty. He stood for strength and chivalry in her young mind, and she always thought of him as a rough but courteous Bruce, with shaggy locks and tartan kilts flying in the wind. It was only a girlish fancy, but to her, the Ben was a living personality, nature's gentleman, a Highland chief. For 22 years she had bid him good morning and waved him a good night. For 22 years she had wandered among the heather, bathed in the loch, and driven into Callendar once a week to do her shopping. And now she wondered why this sorrow should have come to her. 6 months ago she had been out in the woods gathering rowan berries. She had gone home gay and bright, but there was no welcoming figure of Uncle John waiting at the door for her. She went into his study and... oh, the horror of it! He was sitting at his desk, his eyes open wide, his mouth twisted sideways, his hands cold. He did not answer her call. She knew he was dead. Heart failure, the doctor said, and Shiela felt that the light had gone out of her world. The funeral over, she had gone into the library with Mr. MacArthur, her uncle's attorney. At first, Shiela did not understand what Mr. MacArthur was trying to tell her. She couldn't realize that she had been left penniless, with only a heavily mortgaged estate as a legacy. Mr. MacArthur advised her to sell Craig, pay off the mortgage, and with what little remained over, fit herself to take her place among the workers of the great world. But Shiela refused to sell her home. Every stone was precious to her, every corner was a dear, living friend. At last she agreed to let it on a 5-year lease to a rich American widow. "What do you intend doing now?" he asked. "I shall have about £100. I shall go to London and try and get something to do there." She was obstinate. She procured cheap rooms in London in a road derisively called Eyre Street. Her £100 did not go far. In vain she tried for work in the great metropolis. No one wanted her. Depressed and silent, she sat in her little room and wondered what would happen when her scanty money gave out. She was a petite maid, with nut-brown hair and grey eyes that looked all too trustingly at a cruel and heartless world. She had no money to spend on amusements, and as she walked the streets of the great city, she saw visions of the long ago. She wandered in Lincoln's Inn and saw the passing of sedan chairs, watched gallants with silken coat and jewelled sword bend low before their lady loves. She sought out old London and lived alone in the 17th century. Always psychic, her gift seemed trebled in her sorrow and loneliness, and her only friends now were the dim ghosts of the past. She was sitting in the gardens of Lincoln's Inn one day when she suddenly became aware of a quaint figure beside her, a wizened man of perhaps 60 years, in a dark, claret-coloured suit, with a black 3-cornered hat upon his knee, and as she looked, he took a pinch of snuff from a beautifully enamelled box and applied it to his nostrils, his little finger delicately poised like a bird on the wing. "You are sad and lonely, little lady," he said suddenly. "Why not help those that are sad and lonely too? You have a gift, a most wonderful gift of sight. Use that sight for your own benefit and the benefit of mankind. I promise you, you will not fail." "But how?" she began, but the quaint little figure had gone, and there was only a fat old woman with an untidy dress and a rusty black bonnet, watching her curiously from the further corner of the seat. Shiela felt dazed. She rose and looked around. No, she was still in the bustling world of taxis and motor buses. The picturesque past had vanished. She smiled a little and went home, but her brain was working hard. She slept well that night, and when morning came, her mind was made up. For the next 3 days, an advertisement appeared in the agony column of the Times. Lady of gentle birth, Scottish, young, penniless, possessing strong psychic powers, will devote her services to the solving of uncanny mysteries or the laying of ghosts. Offer quite genuine. Reply with particulars and remuneration offered to S.C. Care of Mrs. Barker, 14B Eyre Street, Regent's Park, London. And now she was waiting. 2 days had passed since her advertisement had first appeared. A double knock sounded. The postman. A footstep sounded outside, and Mrs. Barker appeared. "Registered letter for you, my dear," she remarked cheerily. "I'll be bringing your supper in half a tick. See, it's a bloater tonight, ain't it? Poor man's steak, I calls it." And Sheila shuddered slightly. The well-meant vulgarity repelled her. The stench of cooking fish nauseated her. She felt nervy, restless, ill. The Highlands were calling her. She longed to feel the springy heather under her feet, to drink in the strong air. It was the cold of the hills. She looked at the thick-crested envelope curiously. It was certainly an answer to her advertisement, for it was addressed to her initials, S.C. Slowly she read it, and a flush of excitement crept into her cheeks. Dunfunery, Loch Long, N.B. If S.C.'s offer is really genuine, will she accept the enclosed £10 on account for immediate expenses, and wire Lady Kildrummy that she is prepared to try to solve, and perhaps lay forever, the very unpleasant mystery known as the Kildrummy Weird? If S.C. states the time she will arrive at Arrowcar Station, Lady Kildrummy will see that there is a car sent to meet her. Sheila's eyes glowed. Arrowcar, Scotland. Her luck had turned at last. She was going back to her beloved Highlands. But would she succeed in her undertaking? Then she remembered the little old man in Lincoln's Inn. "You will not fail," he had said. Of course she had heard of the Kildrummy Weird. Who had not? Was it not as much speculated upon as the hidden mystery of Glamis? Was it not even as mysterious? What was the story? Did not some great calamity happen when the Weird appeared? Next day she wired Lady Kildrummy that she would come at once, and she caught the night train to Glasgow, where she changed for the West Highland line. At Arrowcar Station, over which bend Lomond Towers, she looked around eagerly. A tall man in the late 30s came towards her, a handsome man, rugged, strong, in a kilt of the Cameron tartan, his mother's clan. "Miss Crerar?" he asked, raising his bonnet. "I'm Stavordale Hartland. My aunt, Lady Kildrummy, asked me to meet you." His voice was pleasantly tuneful, and the wholesome admiration in his eyes could do naught but please her. Instantly she compared him to rugged Ben Lady, and, had the man at her side but known, it was the greatest compliment she could have paid him. Dunfunery was situate on the Argyllshire side of Loch Long, nestling under the great shoulder of the cobbler himself. Lady Kildrummy met her with outstretched hands. "How good of you to come, my dear. Are you by any chance related to Crerar of Kencraig?" "He was my uncle." "Then you are doubly welcome, for Kencraig was my late husband's greatest friend. Now, Stavordale, you can leave Miss Crerar and me to have tea together." It was not until they had finished their tea that her hostess commenced her story. "My dear, I am in great trouble," she said by way of starting. "Your advertisement interested me, and I wondered if you could lay forever the weird that haunts this place. Up to now, the story has been kept absurdly secret. I think none of us wanted to believe in it. Since the time of Connacht the Strong in the latter part of the 16th century, Kildrummy has been cursed by this weird. Every 23 years some terrible calamity has occurred in the family, preceded for about 6 months by the eyes." "The eyes?" "Yes, the eyes of doom, they are called. The Kildrummy Weird takes the form of eyes that appear and disappear, and are mainly seen in the West Wing. In recent years, calamity has fallen on this house after the eyes have been seen. In 1874, the year I was married, my husband's 2 elder brothers died, each by his own hand. One was found drowned in the loch, The other was shot on the summit of the Cobbler, yonder. At both inquests the verdict was accidental death, but we all knew better. It was the eyes that had driven them mad. My husband became heir to the title, and in 1897 my eldest son poisoned himself. Again, it was put down to an accident. He was dabbling in photography, and it was supposed that he took some cyanide by mistake for his medicine. But it was no accident. 23 years had passed, and he had seen the eyes. This is 1920, Miss Crerar. 3 years since Diarmid died, and I am afraid my son Duncan, the only one left to me, is now 26 years old. Lately he has complained of being kept awake at night by curious creakings. He has seen strange lights and, he is changed. I can't explain what I mean. You will see for yourself. He is all nerves. I am convinced he has seen the eyes of doom. Will you try and solve the mystery for me, Miss Crerar? What the cause is I don't know, but the hideous waiting for some tragedy to fall is terrible. I'll do my best, Lady Kildrummy. I can promise you no more. That evening Shiela met Duncan Kildrummy. Although young, he was a distinguished soldier, had won the DSO and been mentioned several times in dispatches, and had the reputation among his friends of being a regular daredevil. But Shiela had a shock when she saw him. His hands were restless, the flesh under his eyes was puffy and dark, and if he was spoken to suddenly, his whole body would respond with nervous twitchings. Lady Kildrummy, she said after dinner, will you put your son into another room to sleep and leave his empty for me to examine? I can see he is in a state of great mental distress. Can't you get him to go away for a change? It's no use, Miss Crerar. I have begged him to go away, but nothing will induce him to leave. That night Shiela changed into a dark rest gown, and when everyone had retired to bed, she prowled up and down the long corridors, armed only with a tiny flash lamp. She unlocked the chapel door and went inside. Suddenly, she felt an icy blast that seemed to pierce through her, and the heavy door closed silently behind her. She felt startled and tried to open it, but the catch was down on the other side. She was locked in. The sudden gust of wind was not repeated, yet she found she was shivering with cold from head to foot. Always venturesome, the thought never entered her head to find a way of rousing the household. If she was unable to get out, she would stay in the chapel till day came. She sat down in one of the old-fashioned pews and looked about her. The moon was conveniently bright, and she could distinguish objects quite clearly by its light. As she sat, she became aware that someone was looking at her, and she turned sharply round. A pair of eyes was gazing at her, eyes so mournful, so full of grief that Shiela felt her own fill with tears of sympathy. And as she met the piteous gaze, she became suddenly conscious of the fact that the eyes were not framed by a face. She rose with a startled exclamation of horror and turned away, but to her right another pair of eyes appeared, eyes this time that were mad with hate, eyes so filled with loathing and malevolence that Shiela backed away from them in fear. But now the whole chapel seemed filled with the ghastly sight, eyes with expression, eyes without, eyes kind, eyes cruel, eyes imbecile, eyes fanatical, eyes with every expression in them that man could conceive. Shiela put her hands to beat the swelling mass away, but even as her arms were extended in front of her, they were caught in a ghostly vice, and she was dragged to the vestry door. She was drawn by unseen hands, hands that possessed an unseen body. All that she could see of her captor was two eyes, eyes that shone in the moonlight and that looked at her with cruel menace. The vestry door swung silently open, and she was dragged through, followed by the eyes. She had no time to look around, for the door that communicated with the west wing, which was always doubly locked and barred, now stood wide open, and through it Shiela was taken. The west wing was partly a ruin, and the wind whistled through glassless windows and roofless halls. Then the grip of iron relaxed, and she found she was in a small turret chamber, and around her were 23 pairs of eyes, all baleful and cruel, except one, and that one pair seemed as if they might belong to a wounded deer. So plaintive were they, so mournful and sad. Sheila moved towards the door, but the eyes surrounded her. She tried to dodge them, tried to get away from them, but it was impossible. She was as keenly guarded as if by living bodies. Then she grew really frightened, terrified. Her brain seemed to go numb, her teeth chattered, and she cried aloud in her agony of dread. But the eyes grew fiercer and more cruel. They seemed to menace her. With a cry, she threw herself at the bodiless terrors, and all became dark. For a while she remembered nothing. Then she was conscious that she was being carried down long corridors and up steep stairs. There was the sound of a click, and a voice said, "Do you want anything, Miss Crerar? I heard you call out, so I came across to you." It was Lady Kildrummy. "I'm thirsty," cried Sheila, "and oh, please, Lady Kildrummy, will you put the light on?" But Lady Kildrummy stared in amazement, for she had switched on the electric light as she entered the room. She bent over the girl. Her eyes were open wide, but they met her gaze with a cold stare. The sight had gone. My dear," she breathed. "What has happened?" I hardly know. I was in the chapel. Oh, do please put on the light. It's so dark here." Tenderly, the elder woman put her arms about the girl. "Tell me first what is the matter," she said gently. "The dark is so peaceful, and I am here with you." Incoherently, Sheila spoke. "I was in the chapel, through the turret room. There were 23 eyes." The girl's voice trailed off. She seemed to be in a stupor, but her eyes were still wide open. Lady Kildrummy rang a bell. "Tell Dr. Graham to come here at once," she said to the startled maid. "Miss Crerar is ill." The genial doctor, a guest in the house, came hurriedly and examined the girl. "She's had a shock," he said. Her eyes, cried Lady Kildrummy distractedly. "My God, blind, but she was all right at dinner," said the doctor. That night a watchful vigil was kept over Sheila, and when the sun rose she awoke from her torpor and looked at Lady Kildrummy in amazement. "What is the matter?" she asked, curiously. "Why are you here?" And her hostess realized that she had regained the power of sight. When the doctor saw her, he stared at her in amazement. "My dear young lady, why, bless my soul, there's nothing wrong with her." Sheila told Lady Kildrummy of her experience in the night, but her hostess smiled. "You have certainly described the turret room, Miss Crerar, but you couldn't have got into it last night, as I hold the key." "But I did," protested Sheila. "The door was open wide." "Well, we will go and look at it as soon as you are up, but I assure you it would be quite impossible for anyone to open the door without my key." "Now," said Lady Kildrummy later, "you see this door is twice bolted and twice locked." The bolts were stiff and the key turned with great difficulty, but the nail-studded door swung open at last. Sheila gave a little cry of triumph. The floor, thickly coated with the dust of ages, was marked by freshly made footprints of long, pointed boots that crossed and recrossed each other, and among the old-fashioned prints were some made by a little, light, modern shoe. Sheila took hers off and bent down to the mark nearest the door. It fitted exactly. "I was here last night," she whispered, hysterically. But Lady Kildrummy was almost speechless, and terror shone in her eyes. "The eyes of doom," she muttered hoarsely. "God help us, for our troubles are beginning." That night, as Sheila was preparing for bed again, the melancholy eyes appeared. She looked at them fearfully. It was an awe-inspiring sight to watch those expressive eyes move about, propelled by an unseen force. They seemed to float in the air, and she knew their power of locomotion rested in the bodies that were hidden from her sight. And, even as she waited, the other eyes manifested themselves. She tried to resist, but the ghostly hands were too strong, and again she was taken to the turret room. A circle of eyes was around her. eyes on a level with her own, but only space above them and space below. But they seemed less malignant, less cruel, though terrifying nonetheless. They seemed to be trying to tell her something, but she was unable to read their message. She was nervous, she was on the defensive, and unconsciously she rendered herself out of tune with the weird. She was not in a fit psychic state to understand them. She was in too material a condition. The eyes seemed to realize this, and they grew menacing again, fretful, impatient. Again there came to the girl a space of forgetfulness, and when she awoke to reality she was back in her room, and she realized she was blind. She moved uncertainly about the room. Everything seemed unfamiliar to her, unreal. Her eyes hurt her, they seemed inflamed, they were sore. All night long the pain was unbearable, and she sat on a chair, helpless and miserable. But as the dawn came, so a veil seemed to be lifted from her eyes, and she could see once more. It was a blindness that came with the darkness, and went with the morning light. During the day, Shiela was trying to get into communion with the astral world. She was trying to fit herself to see even deeper into the mysteries of the unknown. It was her first trial alone, and she was gradually becoming fitted for the task she had set herself. Daily, Duncan Kildrummy grew more silent, more morose, more taciturn. The Kildrummy weird was trying to claim him as its victim, and he realized it, and knew he was too weak to hold out against it for long. Soon, he too would die, and die accidentally, as so many members of his family had done. The eyes grew more venturesome. One night a pair hovered over the dinner table and gazed at Duncan intently. All saw them, and as Lady Kildrummy screamed in terror, they disappeared. But Duncan rose and stumbled blindly out of the room. Stavardale went quickly after him and found his cousin staring at the cold waters of the loch. He was staring, and there was a look of madness in his eyes. The next night, several pairs circled around him. He tried to beat them off, but they seemed always just out of his reach, and their expression mocked him. Stavardale Hartland attached himself to Shiela, and she found his strong personality a great help to her in the nerve-wracking time she was going through. Night after night, when the eyes claimed her, she found she was a helpless entity in their grasp. And in the turret room they supplicated, entreated, menaced her, and still she was unable to read their meaning. And daily the eyes seemed to appear more often. They followed Duncan from room to room, they drove him out of the house, and he would disappear for hours at a time, and his mother's heart would ache with apprehension. One night, Shiela resolved not to go to bed, and Lady Kildrummy and Stavardale agreed to sit up all night with her in the library. For Shiela had come to dread the period of blindness that was forced upon her in so mysterious a way, and she wondered if in company she would be strong enough to resist the ghostly hands. First one pair of eyes appeared, and then another, until all 23 pairs surrounded the trio. As if turned to stone, Lady Kildrummy and Stavardale Hartland watched Shiela forcibly dragged out of the room. They could neither move nor speak, and when Shiela returned to them she found that 3 helpless people would have to stay in the library until dawn, for this time they were all blind. Next night, Shiela and Stavardale were standing together, watching Duncan walking restlessly up and down the terrace. "Don't you think you had better give all this up, little girl?" said Stavardale Hartland, and his voice held a tender, caressing note. "I can't," she said passionately. "Look at him. He is all his mother has. Can't you see the eyes are driving him mad? The weird will claim another victim unless I can prevent it." And even as she spoke, the evil eyes appeared, phosphorescent in the darkness, and with a wild shriek, Duncan Kildrummy fled into the blackness of the night. Until the morning he roamed the country at large, and when he appeared at breakfast, he was haggard and worn, and the most inexperienced eye could tell that he was really ill. Shiela alone seemed to have a soothing effect upon him, and when later in the day Dr. Graham administered a sleeping draught, He suggested that Shiela should sit by his bedside until it took effect. Lady Kildrummy left her for a moment, and immediately Shiela was conscious that the eyes were watching her. Before she realised it, she was in the turret room, and she found she was numb from head to foot. She was powerless to move. As she watched, the eyes suddenly materialised into men. Gradually their bodies appeared until 22 men in doublet and hose stood before her. Their garments were of silk and velvet, rich, costly, gay, and the 23rd of that ghostly company was a girl, almost a girl of not more than 15 years. Her hair was unbound and her face distorted with grief, and she clung piteously to a black-bearded man of middle age. A ghostly play began, and all the while Shiela watched with increasing horror. Others appeared on the scene, men in kilt and plaid, with dirks drawn, dirks red with blood. Roughly the girl was torn from the arms of her father and bound with hempen ropes. The scenes that followed were hideous to behold, and Shiela knew that there was a power at work that compelled her to watch. The captive girl writhed and tore at her bonds, but all to no purpose. They were too cunningly tied. Not a word was said aloud, but the agonized expressions, the black terror spoke louder than words. 2 ghostly figures in black carried in a red-hot brazier. The coal burned and seemed to splutter, yet made no sound. 2 long irons were placed in the glowing coals. The prisoners made a desperate effort to overpower their captors. For a few moments the whole place was in confusion, but gradually their efforts were subdued, and one by one they were dragged to the fire. One by one the red-hot iron was plunged into their eyes. One by one they were blinded and flung aside to die. Shiela watched 22 men done to death in this awful way. She watched their agonies of pain, their writhings, their torments, and the scene was all the more horrible because of the deathly silence that accompanied it. There was but one more victim, the girl. Roughly she was dragged to the brazier, but a merciful providence intervened. She stumbled and fell, and when a man roughly turned her over with his foot, he found the gentle spirit had fled. The assassins looked round the room at the dead, and even as they did so the scene changed, and Shiela found she was out in the Chestnut Avenue, standing before the giant tree, the pride of Dunfunerey. The rain poured down in torrents, the wind blew hard, her dress clung to her figure and chilled her, her shoes were covered with mud. A black-cowled monk approached, with beads and breviary. Horror came into his countenance as he stumbled over the still, warm bodies. He touched the girl in gentle pity, but he was jostled away rudely. He opened his book, and Shiela could see that he was pleading to be allowed to say a prayer over the bodies. A huge man struck him, and as he picked himself up he silently cursed the murderers. He cursed them on the holy book, but they jeered in his face and continued their nefarious work. There, under the spreading chestnut tree, a pit was dug, and with neither prayer nor priest, into it the girl was flung. Then followed the other 23. The hole was small. The bodies protruded above the sides. With a ribald smile on his cruel face, the menacing figure in black forced the ground to receive them. The pit was covered in with earth. The murdered ones were safely hidden away, and Shiela realised she had witnessed a scene that had taken place some 300 years before, a scene that had been reenacted for her benefit. At last she knew what the eyes had tried to tell her. The figures died away. They seemed to be absorbed into the atmosphere itself, and once more only 23 pairs of eyes were left. But they were eyes that looked at her with gratitude. They knew, she understood. And as she watched them too fade away, she was conscious that her limbs were once more warm. She looked round in bewilderment. There on the bed lay the sleeping form of Duncan Kildrummy. She was back in his room. She felt her dress, it was quite dry. Her shoes had no trace of mud upon them. Lady Kildrummy entered. "My dear, I'm sorry," she said. "I am afraid I have been rather a long time. Why?" She broke off. "What's the matter?" For Shiela was gazing at the open door, and her expression was soft and pitiful. But Lady Kildrummy could not see the figure of a frail young girl, dressed in a soft homespun, with a white kerchief round her shoulders, a girl who looked at Shiela with thanks in her soft brown eyes. "I think I shall be able to help you lay your weird successfully, Lady Kildrummy," said Shiela. "I'll tell you later, after I've had time to think." Next day a small party gathered underneath the chestnut tree. The turf was smooth and velvety. It had grown undisturbed for many centuries, but now it was being removed. "Ah!" said Shiela suddenly, for as the spade dug deep into the rich brown earth, a skeleton arm appeared. Reverently the mould was moved. 22 skeletons were unearthed, 22 skeletons of full-grown men. But at the bottom of the pit was a tiny skeleton, a skeleton crushed and broken. And Shiela knew it was the last remains of the girl, the weird with the mournful eyes. Reverently the bones were placed in an empty stone sarcophagus in the little chapel, and reverently the minister spoke the prayers for the dead. And, as the last Amen was said, Shiela heard an unseen choir burst out in song. It was the Gloria in Excelsis Deo. Lady Kildrummy drew her cloak about her shoulders. "Do you hear the wind whistling?" she asked. Shiela smiled. She knew. 6 weeks later, Duncan Kildrummy was up for the first time after a serious attack of brain fever, during which for some days his life had been in the balance. But now the nervous twitchings were entirely gone, and his eye was clear and steady. "And you think we are free of the weird at last?" asked Lady Kildrummy as she was bidding Shiela goodbye. "I hope so. I don't know the history of the turret room, but I should say the 23 were trapped there, and perhaps for religious reasons were foully murdered by some of your forebears. They were refused a Christian burial, and that accounted for their hatred and their hauntings. Their poor spirits were unable to rest in peace. Every 23 years, their number, they returned, but they could not make themselves understood." Stavridale accompanied Shiela to Glasgow. He was very silent during the journey, but as the train was drawing into the city, he suddenly took one of her hands. "Miss Crerar, Shiela, I won't you give all this up?" he urged. I can't, Mr. Hartland." "But why? Shiela, won't you be my wife?" I can't explain, but I have a mission to fulfill. I've set myself a task, and I must complete it." She smiled at him. "Won't you wait a little?" "Then you do care," he said triumphantly as he sought to draw her towards him. But the train had already stopped at the platform of the Glasgow terminus. Then all was bustle and rush, and it was not until he said goodbye to her as she left for Edinburgh, where she had engaged rooms, that he realised she had not replied to his question. Well, perhaps the time was not yet ripe for his love-making, but he realised whate'er might befall, he had met his fate, and, like a knight in days of long ago, the wish of his lady was his law. He would bide her time, impatient though he might be. This has been Shiela Crerar, Psychic Detective, written by Ella M. Scrymsour, narrated by Naomi Rose Mock. Copyright 2021 by Praxiscope Productions. Production copyright by Praxiscope Productions.